Friends, allies, and Americans, welcome to the Defense of Democracy podcast, where we tell the stories of folks who defend your children's rights by advocating for inclusive public school systems and who fight for diversity across our nation. I'm your host, Karen Swoboda. Let's get into it. Today on the Defense of Democracy podcast, it's my pleasure to welcome Maurice Cunningham. Maurice is an author. He wrote a book called Dark Money and the Politics of School Privatization. He has done a lot of fascinating work in the research of this book, and I am very thrilled to have him on the show. Maurice, welcome to the Defense of Democracy podcast.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
You're welcome. Now, Maurice, your book, which, the title of it is so prescient and so timely, but it's interesting to me that you actually wrote that book before Moms for Liberty existed, before the attack on the public schools that is like practically a day-to-day occurrence right now. Yeah. Tell me about where you initially started when you wrote that book.
Yeah, well, what happened with that book was in January of 2016, I happened to read an article in the Boston Globe that said there's a move to increase the number of charter schools in Massachusetts. And if it didn't pass the legislature, the advocates would put a ballot proposal on the ballot, and they'd spend up to $15 million. And I thought, I knew a lot about Massachusetts politics. I said, my heavens, no one's ever spent anywhere near that. Where would they get that money from? And then when I dug a little deeper, I discovered that the Globe wouldn't tell us where they got the money from, and they weren't going to look either. So I got very interested in it, and I began to dive in, and they eventually did spend about $25 million. It was well hidden during the campaign, although I named a lot of the figures who ultimately, after the campaign, were disclosed. And so I became very interested in dark money. And you're right, what's different in 2021 is these groups like Moms for Liberty and Parents Defending Education come upon the scene. And it's sort of a hard right turn. But the right-wing money was already there, pushing vouchers, pushing charters, and so forth. For example, Betsy DeVos's organization, Americans, what is AFC, Americans for Children? They've been around for a number of years and so forth. They weren't involved in the 2016 campaign here, but the number of these groups have been around. And then in 2021, it explodes with these new groups who take what I call white backlash groups.
Yes. And so, it's funny, you're bringing up Betsy DeVos and I am, I'm learning as quickly as I can and absorbing as much as I can. And the good thing about the fact that I don't know an awful lot about politics or these topics is that I can give it, to the perspective of our listeners who also may not know that much. I remember learning about Betsy DeVos through the Trump administration and just kind of being bewildered because it was so clear to me that she hated the public school system, and she was what was her position in government? It was like the head of the education, right?
Yeah. She was the education secretary. Yeah.
Right.
She's now advocating to abolish the department she led.
Yes. Right. Wild. So tell me, so let's talk about your book. Like, what is covered in the book and how is it relevant to what's going on today?
I think what's really relevant about it is it talks a lot about how these organizations are funded and how they hide their true funders, and how to go about finding them, and how about pressing the media to do so and writing letters to the editor and uncovering these things yourself. Because in some cases, the media won't do it, although it should be their job, but they don't do it, and citizens have to do it themselves. This money stays hidden for two very closely related reasons. One is that if we know where the money is coming from, if we know it's not coming from families and parents and moms, but instead it's coming from the Walton family, it's coming from Charles Koch, it's coming from Betsy DeVos, then we begin to raise questions about it because we know that they have far different policy preferences for public schools than we do. They want to destroy public schools. We want to make them stronger. People in the community want to make them stronger. And so they
Right.
have to remain hidden. And this is a very important part. So I write a lot about that in the book. And so I think that's very relevant because so much of it is uncovering money that comes through foundations and so forth. And we often think of foundations as philanthropies, and who doesn't like
Mhm.
philanthropies? Oh, they do good things. Well, they're often used for interest groups advocacy, and the real interests are hidden. And so you have to dive into finding out who's really funding these upbeat sounding names, moms and parents and families. Who
Right.
doesn't like it? Well, we have to find out what's really behind them, and that is very revealing.
And so about what you have found. I mean, what things have you unveiled in doing your research?
Well, Parents Defending Education, for example, um, is very much Koch network, right? Uh,
Mm,
Donors Trust funds it. Donors Trust is what's called a donor advised fund. It's a way for people with a lot of money to
yep.
kind of launder it, so you can't tell who's really giving it. But there are other foundations that give to Parents Defending Education that are clearly well-known members of the Koch network. You've got Moms for Liberty, which has been funded by Richard Uihlein, a billionaire from right-wing donor from the Midwest, by Julie Fancelli, who has funded Moms for Liberty, and also poured at least $3 million into the January 6th Stop the Steal rally. And so when we can trace the money, we can set, we can see who they are. And even when you can't trace the money, you look at very early, it's hard to trace the money, but you look at their contractors and say, Moms for Liberty, or Parents Defending Education. How is it they've got a Federalist Society right wing law firm that has represented Trump? How do they afford this group? Well, and where is the social media coming from? And, why is Moms for Liberty's press being handled by Rick Scott's former chief of staff, the now senator, former governor of Florida? And you begin to piece together these folks, who's surrounding them, where the real action is. And it really leads back to these big money sources.
And it's interesting also for those who don't know, groups like Moms for Liberty are what's called a 501c4. When organizations, most nonprofit organizations that you look at, whether it's a pet rescue or food bank, are something called a 501c3. And a 501c3 organization is required um, to divulge where they get their money from. They have to be transparent about it. A 501c4 doesn't have to be transparent about it, which is why when Moms for Liberty started, I don't know if they're still saying this. It was funny to me when they did. Just knowing what I know with my background in nonprofit, when they said, "Oh, we're making all our money from T-shirt sales," right? Like that was their thing in the beginning. And it just because I remember I went to the one of their events. This was a year and a half ago. I was protesting at a Moms for Liberty event, and I was looking at the quality of materials, like the bunting. It was a 4th of July thing, and they had
Yeah,
fabric bunting. And I remember thinking, I've worked for national major organizations, the American Cancer Society, like all of these
yeah,
well-known, well-funded organizations. We never had fabric bunting because it's so expensive.
yeah.
And so you knew that this wasn't where it was coming from. And to your point, they can get away with hiding that if they're a C4.
Yeah,
Um,
they have hidden it, and so that's important
yeah,
because a C3 is very beneficial. Your donors can get a tax deduction for a C3, but not a C4.
right.
So there's a lot of advantages to a C3, but they don't use it because they have to keep their donors hidden.
Yes.
Yeah,
And their donors, like you're mentioning the Koch brothers, um, are very have an agenda of their own for changing the country. Like these are people who are
yeah,
interested in this becoming in the United States of America becoming an autocracy, or and a religiously based Christian or nation, right? and
that's
and
right.
that is when you've got that kind of money, you pour it into these groups and they pretend that they're grassroots.
Yeah.
That's what they use to fool people.
Well, there's a very powerful right-wing kind of umbrella group called the Council for National Policy. And a lot of the other groups you might hear of, Heritage Foundation, Leadership Institute, Turning Point USA, National Rifle Association, they're all represented on the Council for National Policy, which kind of sets the agenda. And the Council for
Mhm.
National Policy sent a memo to DeVos and to Trump in 2017. And here's what the memo said. It said, at the end of the memo, it said, what you should be moving toward is getting rid of public education to replace it with free market schools, religious schools, and homeschools as the normative American experience. Now, that's right from their
Mhm.
memo. And I will tell you, what does that mean? That means what school choice means is you have the choice of a corporate for-profit school. You could send it to a Christian indoctrination school, or you can homeschool. There's
Mhm.
your choice. That's what the Council for
That's it.
National Policy is, and that's what's driving this: is destroy public education, replace it with religious schools, for-profit schools, and homeschooling.
And we can get into all the problems. I mean, there are obvious problems that first come to the as soon as you hear that. But then the other problems are that, if you're a private school can deny anybody, any child from attending if they decide that they don't want to provide services for a child with disabilities. They can deny that. Whereas public schools
That's
have
right.
to take everybody, and public schools have requirements for their educators that private schools don't have.
That's right. And
So,
if you think
yeah,
about the history of the move to get away from public schools, it really is accelerated in the 1950s during the early years, right into the 70s of desegregating public schools, when many folks set up private schools in order to flee the public school system so they didn't have to desegregate. And that's the origins of it, indeed.
absolutely. So, why is and so it's easy for them to hide because they don't have to share it, right? That's why it's so simple. Is there anything else to it? Is it
Well, yeah, I think ultimately you were right in casting this as part of an overall plan, really to take
yeah,
down much of what the federal government does in education, in abortion rights, in health, education, and welfare. We've mentioned the Heritage Foundation. They have a 900-page plan that sort of spells it out. But it's very clear in education they're trying to do
project
away.
you're referencing Project
Project
2025?
2025. They're trying to do away with the Department of Education and privatize public schooling. But beyond that, they're trying to advocate for example, replacing neutral civil servants with a great deal of expertise with basically Trump loyalists. That's what it
Right.
is. So there's I think 64,000 jobs they have targeted, and on the other hand, they're right now conducting interviews and pre-screening of people to fill those positions. The only real requirement being loyalty to right-wing policy making and to the Trump administration, hoped for by them, Trump administration.
And
So it's very, very
that should
serious.
terrify everyone. That should terrify everybody. This is not paranoia. This is not like tinfoil hat time. This is actually what's happening. You can find it on online, and Defense of Democracy has information about it, and there's information about it everywhere. And it's a very complex network. It's you had to do a lot of digging to connect all of these dots in your book. Is that right?
Oh yeah, it takes a lot of research. It's fascinating when you get into it. At least I found it fascinating. But these are very, very wealthy people who can hire smart people to hide stuff for them. So even at its best, you can't find it. But there are, they send some signals. But I mean, I'm discouraged to see sometimes major media don't pick up on the signals. The Washington Post. For heaven's sakes, sort of runs adulatory articles about Moms for Liberty without really using the depth of journalism that they have there to stop and say, wait a minute,
Right.
who are these people really? And that's happened again and again. And so that's been, a sort of an unearned advantage for these sorts of groups, is that some of the major media have not looked carefully at them. The right wing media are simply propaganda outlets. Rush Limbaugh and Fox News and Breitbart and so forth they're going to regurgitate what they get from these folks. But I think major media really need to step up their game on this.
So always on every podcast that we hold, we do a shout out about halfway through. And today's shout out, I would like to give it to Bruce Rutter, who is a member of our board of directors. And Maurice, you met him when I briefly introduced you because you're both Massachusetts natives. And I want to say not only to Bruce, but to all the members of the Defense of Democracy Board of Directors who are incredibly hardworking, roll up your sleeves, get things done board. We would not be where we are without their help. So I'm very grateful to Bruce and the rest of the board members. Now, Maurice, back to our discussion. You used Massachusetts, speaking of Massachusetts, as like a case study for what's going on. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's applicable elsewhere, as I said, because the mechanisms are the same. For years before this ballot question was on the ballot, there were interest group advocacy organizations, Families for Excellent Schools primarily, that were sort of doing the drumbeat. They were issuing reports and so forth. They were doing outreach. They were meeting with legislators toward charters. And that was going on for several years before the ballot. Now, when it went to a ballot, you had to form a ballot committee, and that ballot committee had to be funded. And what was going on, let me back up. The foundations were, or Families for Excellent Schools was being funded by Boston Foundation, by Combined Jewish Philanthropies, by other foundations. So you could kind of belatedly tell where that money was coming from, but it wasn't a focus of any stories. And then the ballot committee formed, and then you have to disclose to the Office of Campaign and Political Finance where your money is coming from. So you'd file Great Schools Massachusetts was their ballot committee, and they'd file a report, and the ballot report would say, oh, we got in various amounts adding up to 16, 20, $25 million from Families for Excellent Schools, Advocacy, Inc., and so forth. But what is Families for Excellent Schools advocacy, and who really wrote the checks to give to families? You couldn't tell. Not required to disclose it, or at least at that time they weren't. I was writing about it saying, hey, I think it's these people. And I was right. I was saying, based on who was involved in these foundations ahead of time, who has that kind of money and who has that kind of interest?
Yeah.
I was writing about that. After the campaign, the Office of Campaign and Political Finance actually did investigate, forced disclosure, and the real check writers were disclosed, not in time to help the voters, but at least they were disclosed. I turned out to be, there were a few surprise names on the list, but I actually had most of them. But that is just something, listen, if this is a democracy, we cannot have this sort of undisclosed wild spending by billionaires hidden from the voters, because it's highly relevant information. We need to know who is behind these operations. And it's always tracing back to the money. No money, no Families for Excellent Schools. No money, no Moms for Liberty. No money, no parents defending education. Unlike your group, Karen, these groups and these people that they put up are highly paid political operatives. They are professionals. They are being paid as professionals. They are not volunteers, unlike groups like yours.
Well, and thank you for that. It is stunning sometimes to see the comparison that's made between Defense of Democracy and the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into the work like this, where we get a mention on NPR or the Washington Post, and it's like amazing, whereas the Moms for Liberty was on Alex Jones national radio interview like within a month of them forming. So there's a huge difference. So one of the things that I would love to do at this point, and by the way, everybody who's listening to this, I will be putting a lot of important links in the podcast notes. I'll be putting a link to Maurice's book, which I would recommend everybody to read. I would put, I'm going to put a link to, we have Defense of Democracy has actually a breakdown, a little bit of a graph that shows all of these interconnected different foundations and the people who manage them. It's really, really fascinating. And Maurice, what I would like to do at this point is I always like to wrap up my podcasts on a positive note. And one of the things that your book does, in addition to like sounding the alarm, is talks a little bit about how it's possible to be defeated, like that we can defeat these
Yeah.
elements. So can you give a little bit of hope at the end of the podcast to talk about that?
Sure. It takes a lot of what you are already doing, which is putting elbow grease and volunteer work into it. Well, let me say something. That campaign I talked about, the ballot campaign, wound up as the most well-funded, expensive campaign of all time in Massachusetts at that time. They spent $25 million
Wow.
and lost 62 to 38%. They were blown out at the polls. And the reason they were was because of a concerted effort by community groups, by religious groups who care about their community, by unions,
Right.
teachers, by school committee members, by school superintendents saying these are all these are bad ideas. This is going to hurt education. This is going to hurt children in our community. They have to remain hidden because if their identities are known, they really have no chance. It's our job to expose them, and really, you have to organize. This is your community that is at stake, and people need to be out on the ground working to defeat these kind of people in 2024.
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that again. And I want to say to anybody who's listening, Defense of Democracy, one of the first things we did was an awareness campaign, because this is the thing. We use the word here, you've used it a few times more, as sneak and like slide it in. Like it's awareness. People aren't aware, so it's bringing awareness to the issue. One of the first things Defense of Democracy did in our very first chapter was just do an awareness campaign about what was going on, and we doubled voter turnout. So the numbers are there, right? It's just a message about getting the message out, and what do people do? So this is where I get to put in a little plug and say, listen, if you're hearing this and you're concerned about your public schools, Defense of Democracy is national. We need people from every background to keep our schools safe and equitable and the best interest of what our kids need. Please check out defenseofdemocracy.org to support or get involved in your local chapter. Maurice, I want to thank you for attending the podcast today. I think this was a great discussion. I wish you the best of luck with the future writings that you're going to be working on. There's definitely going to be no shortage, I think, in the weeks and months to come of things to look at. And I hope that you will join me again in the near future.
Anytime. I appreciate it, Karen. Keep fighting.